So when we're looking at isometrics as a style, what it means is that the two, you sort of have perspective, but it's not real perspective because it doesn't diminish with distance. So it's not 3-point perspective. It's just sort of like a fake top-down or bottom-up sort of view. The thing that brings it all together is that the angles are always 30 degrees. So this angle here is 30 degrees, and this angle here is 30 degrees. So there's a couple of ways that you could use Adobe Illustrator to make sure that all of your shapes and lines automatically fill in. You could use a rectangular grid. You could modify the document grid so that the angle from the upper left corner to the lower right corner was 30 degrees. But that's not always that easy to use, and it's kind of a little easier if you can actually see the grid, the guide grid, as an actual isometric grid that then you can use guide snapping to draw everything on a perfect isometric grid. So the only real thing that we're doing that would be new here in Adobe Illustrator is building ourselves a custom grid using guides. So this is how you can do that. And it's just really useful for isometric grid. So part of the project here that you guys can go through this step when you're ready to start this project is build your own isometric grid. So I'm going to go through how to do that quickly here. So in this particular case, typically when we're building isometrics, not always, but typically we're doing it for web. So I just like to use pixels as my dimension when I'm putting together isometrics, just because snap to pixel and guide is kind of useful. And we can always adapt this to print later. But a very common size would be 1920 by 1080, which is just your standard HD screen. Just helps you because you're sometimes doing pixel preview and you sort of want to see how everything snaps together in pixel mode. And if you do everything really tight in Adobe Illustrator in pixels, it'll just scale up well for print later. So the first thing I like to do when I'm building an isometric grid is go to my view and snap to pixel. Okay, so what we're going to be doing is we're going to be making ourselves a grid out of guides that is rotated at 30 degrees. So you can sort of decide how big you want that grid to be. Let's just zoom in close here. I'm going to say I want a 10 pixel grid. So I'm going to drag a guide down. It's going to start by default at 0, but we're going to go to 10. And then we're going to, we can do a few of these, we don't have to do too many. Put another one at 20. Let's just grab 2 of them and duplicate, so hold down the Alt key. So what we're really doing is we're just filling our whole screen with a horizontal grid pattern using guides. So I'm just grabbing them so I don't have to duplicate them so many times. So you only have to do this a few times and you're going to fill your whole screen with a 10 pixel guide grid. So I'm just holding down the Alt key to duplicate. Kind of zoomed out a little bit too far there, but the other way you could do this is you could turn on your document grid and then make it 10 pixels and then turn on grid snapping, and it would automatically snap all your guides to 10 pixels as well, but there's nothing wrong with doing it this way also. So you're going to want to cover a little bit more of your screen than you want. I'm just going to zoom in here so I can get it right on that next 10 pixel increment. But you're going to kind of want to fill more than the screen, because when we rotate these guides, we want them to cover the whole area. So we've got this grid here. So now we can go Object Transform. Okay, rotate. And we're going to go 30 degrees. So that's made our 30-degree grid that way. So that's our isometric dimension in that route. And then we're going to want to copy this. And we're going to want to lock those. So Control-2 is the shortcut to lock it, just so we don't accidentally grip them again. And then we're going to go Control-Alt-Shift-V, which is paste in place, or Edit, Paste in place, which is Shift Control V. And then we're going to go to Object Transform Reflect. So we're going to use the vertical reflection. So that just creates the other side of the grid for us. And that's a pretty workable grid. I mean, obviously these upper corners are missing it, so if you wanted to fill those corners in, but really what we're doing is we're just kind of, you can kind of think of building isometric graphics on a grid as almost like building little Lego blocks. So once you've kind of got your first thing, whatever it is you're deciding to do using the isometric style, you can kind of grab it and scale it and fit it all together, and it's all going to kind of fit. So if you were to go to Adobe Stock and grab any one of these little isometric graphics, you could then pull them into your own isometric grid and start adding to them, building your own. This is kind of a nice example here. I think it's kind of nicely done because you can see how it uses a mix of transparency, kind of everything, kind of some nice little round shapes here, but overall it's kind of like a little slice, you know, kind of got some nice feeling of depth and lighting to it and stuff like that. So this would be kind of like a vignette style isometric graphic. So you could do something like that for this project. But something like this also kind of fits in. You know, they often are kind of like these little standalone things, and they can get pretty detailed. This is pretty nicely done. There's lots of nice detail in this little van. So the idea is to just create something that's like a little diorama. It could be, you know, if you're, I think everybody in this class is in the graphic design stream, but I know that some people take Adobe Illustrator 2 as part of the interior design stream, in which case maybe you would do an interior of a room using isometrics. But the key thing here is to get used to using pixel snapping and a custom guide grid in Adobe Illustrator to get your isometric graphic done. So once that's done, you're ready to start drawing, just like with any other Adobe Illustrator graphic. But because you've got view, snap to pixel, and snap to point, you know, you're going to lock all your guides. And now it's pretty easy to start drawing any isometric sort of shape just on this grid. You know, this is your vertical, this is your horizontal, and any sort of individual shape like this is part of your isometric grid. I want to obviously put a color in there. Again, what I like to do for just creating a sense of lighting when I'm doing isometric graphics is, of course, you know, go through and do the actions, delete all your default color palettes again. And I'm just going to use this green just randomly. But I'm going to turn it into a spot color so that I can just easily tint it. So sometimes, you know, I might call that my base green. Let's say I'm just going to draw the top of a green block of grass. So, you know, go up here. I mean, you don't even have to get it perfect the first time. You just kind of eyeball it like, and I missed it there. But because we're using grid snapping, it's real easy to just use the direct selection tool and just go back and move our points around until everything lines up. Use our color to just tint that down. Depending on your zoom level, it can be pretty easy to get things to snap, but it's not going to snap perfectly every time. So let's do this at 50, do this at 25. There's kind of a light green thing. A lot of times after I've got my basic shapes in place, you really want to zoom in and make sure you actually snap those on. And sometimes you have to zoom in pretty close to make sure that it's snapped properly, because I can see up here that I've gone off the grid by a bit. Right there. So again, direct selection tool, you can just kind of grab that whole corner, and now you can move it around and snap it. This is where the snap to grid, snap to pixel can sometimes conflict, because, right, I didn't actually line that up perfectly on the pixel, so I got to turn off snap to pixel at this point. And now snap to point should work. You don't, once you've got your grid built, you don't want snap to pixel turned on anymore. I forgot to turn that off. go back and fix this corner here. So again, we're just really relying on the pixel snapping. I don't even need that line there. That's actually kind of an extra anchor, so I'm just going to delete that. I'm just going to go down and fix that corner there too because it snapped to the pixel. So there's just like a real quick, I'm just turning off the guides there with control semicolon or control colon. So you can kind of see that. So you can start putting together little things, but you can really build out kind of fun stuff really quickly, and set yourself a challenge, make some basic shapes and then get a little more advanced following the isometric shapes, combining things together. Maybe set yourself a challenge of building a little house or a car or whatever. Whatever you just kind of find fun, but I would definitely recommend using a single spot color swatch so that you can apply consistent lighting. It's a real easy way to sort of make sure that everything that's on the dark side, regardless of what color it is, kind of has the same saturation level. So I just used 150, 25, but that's just kind of arbitrary. Of course, you can do overlays, multiple fills with gradients, all that kind of stuff that we've used with any other shape in Adobe Illustrator. But Illustrator really lends itself well to kind of putting things together. So a lot of times what I do is I kind of think of this artboard as my, build it artboard, and then I've got like a second artboard that's just down here where I take things and I might want to scale them down or up depending on how detailed they are. So you just kind of move them off and then scale them down and fit them into your kind of more free-form composition on a second artboard, that you might just draw outside of your grid. So you sort of use this like a construction area, and then once you're happy with your little tree or your van or your tent or whatever it is that you're doing, then you just grab the shape and move it down to your composition artboard and just kind of keep those things together. So another thing too is this is where grouping becomes important. This isn't really a layer, but there's all these, did I move a bunch of guides there?
So you should just have snap to point left on, right?
Yeah, just snap to point. After you've built your grid, after you've built your isometric grid and you've rotated 30 degrees one way, 30 degrees the other, lock those guides down and then turn off pixel grid snapping. And then you'll just have snap to point, and it's really nice and easy to kind of go to town doing.
I made it, I did the grid and made it a template as well, so I could use the file again.
Yes, that is a thing I would encourage for sure, because the isometrics come up a lot. I mean, I've probably done more isometric drawing in Illustrator than I really ever care to do it again, just because it is such a commonly requested thing, and just searching in any stock, you're going to see so much of it. It's hard to bring a real sense of style to isometrics because it's such a rigid method and style or sort of approach to drawing. An isometric kind of is an isometric. There's different approaches to adding shadows and stuff like that and using gradients, which I think really adds a sense of depth. But you can see it's very commonly used to show little work dioramas, and there's just so much of them that are done that if I'm ever tasked with putting together an isometric illustration, maybe it's for an industrial product like an oil company, an energy company, I'm going to turn to stock first because there's just so many pre-built elements that I probably could draw my own, but am I going to come up with something entirely original? Not likely. So it's great that I can go in and grab a bunch of pre-built things. But I think for the purpose of this exercise for Project 5 here, I'd encourage you to definitely make sure you build your own elements. But there's nothing wrong with going and looking at stock for inspiration and just kind of see the different ways that people have approached doing things like curvilinear shapes. Those can fit into an isometric. Everything doesn't have to be blocky. You can do isometric round stuff. I think that example of the this cone, right? You're like, okay, well, how do you build an isometric circle? So an isometric circle is really just an oval. And pick the oval tool. And there's two ways you can drag. Oops, let's go to the correct artboard here. So there's two ways to do it. You can go from the, draw from the middle out, which is typically how I like to do it. So hold down the Alt key, and that'll draw a circle out. But just with the snapping turned on, it's going to automatically fit that circle to the isometric grid. If you don't hold down Alt, then you're just drawing it from the corner. It's kind of 6 1/2 dozen the other, depending on what you're trying to do. Obviously, if you hold down Shift, that's going to make like a vertical circle that's kind of facing you and not fitting on the circle. And then if you did like a, an oval this way, kind of depending on how you shade it, that can be either side of the same thing. Like there's no difference. It's just in where I vertically place the center of it. But the only way I'm going to bring a sense of which way this is facing is just by changing the color. Right, so you can kind of start working with circles and curved shapes that way too. So it's just it really just takes sort of a shift in thinking in terms of how you're thinking about what you're looking at. So I'd sort of say if you're brand new to the concept of drawing isometrics, start with square shapes, and then start adding rounded corners or what have you to do that. I find it can be good practice just to kind of get in there and sort of build a few basic things. Like another thing you can do is do a rounded corner, right? So you go there, but then you just drag the handle like that and snap. So we can do rounded corners on the grid like that. It's pretty common to need to zoom in close and readjust things so that but you want your handles to fit the curves as well, right? So I could do another one this way. I'll get that on the anchor properly. Should line up better than that. There we go. So you can kind of start to play around with shapes like that. This one, if I want to do like a rounded corner thing to cap that off, there's depending on the style of it, I could either just fill that with a gradient, or maybe I could curve it this way. Then I'd probably fill in that little area with a gradient from this color to this one. Depends on how I'm trying to blend it. But just play around with rounding shapes. I often will turn my guides off and on pretty regularly just to sort of see how it's looking while I'm working on it. Kind of go from there. So I'd encourage, before you dive into trying to draw something, just get comfortable building different sort of shapes and kind of practice with using the grid. And I think you'll get comfortable with it pretty quickly. And kind of go from there. I mean, there's no real guidelines in the project itself in terms of what you depict using isometrics. I'd say do whatever you like. If you want to draw a house or a building or a little scene of some sort, that's all good. What I'm mainly looking for is that you follow the grid and that your lines, when you have lines of shapes, that they follow the grid, that they don't kind of deviate from the grid too much, because that sort of ruins it if things don't snap together. And also making sure that you've zoomed in and made sure your corners of things, when you do something basic like a block or what have you, everything snaps together nicely so there's no gaps between them. That way you can scale that graphic up and down, use it for print or whatever, and it's going to look good wherever you use it. that's all there is to it. Isometrics are quite fun and simple. It's something that you can easily dive into quite quickly, and hopefully have some fun with that. So that actually wraps us up for the day.